It's just the nature of the mechanism. It doesn't have that power, right? And this isn't a hugely controversial point that she makes here. Churchland just has the virtue of stating things plainly, right? This is a very plainly and clearly stated problem. Now you might think, well, okay, still I'm not fully convinced that natural selection couldn't maybe by chance select for survival-enhancing beliefs. Actually, an argument that's been developed by a few people in the 20th and early 21st century that really sort of draw a fine point on this, including one by Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, and I don't know how many of you know who he is, but for about 20 years he's been developing an argument that he calls the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And he's developed it in several books, and every time he develops it, he's a very careful and rigorous philosopher, and he'll find something that's like just slightly not right about the argument, and he'll take account of objections. And so I think he's finally nailed it in a form that I honestly think is going to be irrefutable, in which he shows essentially that if you're both a naturalist and you believe in Darwinian evolution, you really have very little reason to think that you're going to have reliable truth-producing faculties. It might just be randomly possible, but it would be random. What's much more likely is that you don't. It's very, very unlikely that you have truth-producing faculties. Now, I'm not going to, this is a lecture unto itself, so I'm not going to give you the full rigor of his argument, but I'm going to show it to you. All right, that's what it looks like. It looks probably a little scarier than it actually is. And it's formulated, and it's kind of what's called a likelihood analysis. And so I'm just going to give you, so don't freak out here, all right? And if you want to look this up, it's in the last chapter of his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. And I write it and try to interpret it in a book called The Magician's Twin, which is actually a book about C.S. Lewis. Because C.S. Lewis developed a much less precise but more intuitive form of this argument in his book, Miracles. And so this is sort of Plantinga's argument. The probability of R, and R is reliable truth-producing faculties. The reliability that we have these reliable truth-producing faculties is low given what he calls naturalism or materialism and Darwinian evolution. Right? So he's not saying it's logically impossible that we could have a capacity for reason and producing true beliefs. It's just that it's extremely low, so low that we ultimately would get to the point where we would not have a rational basis for concluding that either materialism or Darwinism is true. So the belief ends up being what's called self-refuting. It's an argument that refutes itself. All right. Now I'm not going to sort of force you to go through this. You all are looking a little blank already. So I don't want to do that. I'm going to give it to you in a simpler way. I just want you to sort of think about this. Think of it in a historical context. All right. And so think about what we'll call the Darwinian backstory. Okay, and so this is the process. Something like this would need to be true historically if the Darwinian account were true. All right, now the point here is not age of the universe or anything like that. It's just what kind of resources, what kind of explanations are you allowed to have, right, if you're a materialist and a Darwinist, right? So one thing you can't say is that God has guided the history of life. God has made sure the right kind of events happen at the right time and place so that it will lead to a reliable outcome. There's nothing like that, right? So whatever forces and processes there are, they have to be blind. They can't have foresight. They can't have choice. So here's the sort of basic story about, 4.5 or maybe 5 billion years ago. There's various things happening on the early Earth, and there are chemical processes and UV light and volcanoes, and somehow, just simply by sort of a combination of blind luck and chemical forces, you get an early sort of proto-molecule and then ultimately a molecule that is able to reproduce itself. And it's some kind of simple form of life, simpler really than anything we have had here. And then, say around 3.5 or maybe 3.9 billion years ago, you get the first prokaryotes, right? So these are just single-celled, simple organisms without a nucleus. And that's basically all you've got for a couple of billion years. All right, so just think of bacteria. So do bacteria have beliefs? No, surely not, right? They're just, what are they doing? Okay, in a Darwinian account, well, they reproduce, and so some bacteria will do things that are more advantageous than others, and so different populations will predominate. But this goes on for billions of years. All right, just in natural selection, the whole time is culling certain, more advantageous beings. That's all that's happening. There's no beliefs in the story, right? Okay, so this goes on and on. You finally get some multicellular organisms, and then 500 and some million years ago, you finally get various kinds of plants. You get various major forms of animals in the Cambrian explosion. Again, think of crabs and lobsters and simple organisms like this that are still animals. Now, do you think crabs have beliefs and propositions that they reflect on and say, no? Again, you've got all these sort of actions happening, and natural selections is selecting for various things. We still don't have beliefs. All right, then eventually you get mammals, and you get primates, and you get things that look kind of like monkeys and apes. And then, sometime in the last several 100,000 years, you get something like Homo sapiens. Okay, now when did beliefs start here? We don't really know, right, on this story. But presumably it happens, I'm guessing, sometime after the Cambrian explosion and before yesterday, right? So it's somewhere in here. But whenever beliefs started, it was way, way, way out on the far right edge, right? And this whole time natural selection has been selecting and culling for behaviors, all right? And so what you would expect, then, if there are beliefs, that they're not things that, sort of reflect on true propositions. They're just things that kind of spit out on our brains, right? And so that's actually precisely what the materialist says beliefs are. So what beliefs are, they're not what we think they are. They're not these things that we can think and say, I want to do this, and then decide to do that. What beliefs are is they're just structures in our brain, right? They're electrochemical structures, events in our brain. And so there's sort of two options here if you're a materialist. One is called the reductive materialist view. And what that means is that's all they are, is these structures in your brain. And so there might be these chemical structures that are causing your body to do certain things. They don't have anything to do with truth. And you see how that follows, right? Because if beliefs, what are those? They'll sound like kind of immaterial things. Those can't exist. That's the non-reductive materialist. But maybe you say, well, no, but at least we have this sense that we have beliefs, right? You're all sitting there. You have this sense that you have this belief. Wow, I wish we weren't having this lecture on Saturday morning. You think you have that thought. And so the non-reductive materialist will say, okay, that's good. I'll be generous. You do have beliefs like that, but they're called epiphenomena. In other words, they're just things that spin off these chemical structures in our brains. But they're illusory. And moreover, they don't cause anything to happen. There are these structures in our brain that are causing behaviors, and then we have these incidental beliefs that float along. But they don't cause anything. Because if they did, that would mean there are these immaterial things somehow causing things to happen in our brain and have things happen in our body. But either way, beliefs don't get to be things about which you could say that they were true or false. And they can't be things that actually cause things to happen in the real world. All right? That's the implication. And if that's true, right, then that undercuts your conviction that you have reliable beliefs. Reliable in the sense that they point to truth. But then that undercuts your belief that Darwinism is true, and it undercuts your belief that materialism is true. Right? Now you might call that the worst thing you can have happen to a worldview, to turn out that if you work it out, it refutes itself. That's just pretty much as bad as it gets, right? Because it kills itself internal to itself. Right? That's essentially Plantinga's argument. I want to stop there. Is there something at this point that, if you're just deeply confused, now if you're generally a deeply confused person, I can't help you, but I mean on this particular argument, right, is there something that you're still not clear on? This is not easy stuff. And if you don't get this right away, that's okay. Most people don't get this argument right away. What I want you to see is that the leading thinkers who reflect on the implications of materialism in the Darwinian worldview, I don't mean just a kind of generic natural selection idea. I mean Darwinism connected to materialism, that it ends up destroying itself intellectually. Right? And so if you're a materialist and an atheist, you have a very hard time mounting the case for reason. Because, in fact, the capacity of reason, you're appealing to something you don't have a right to in the intellectual framework you've chosen. All right? You look very concerned over here. So, do you have?
I was wondering what you would say to people that would bring up instances of animals being altruistic.
Sure.
And evolution is talking about how humans have evolved to an understanding of religion because it helps us.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to talk about that very thing. Absolutely. So that's a really good question. And remember, if you think, well, but maybe, yeah, something like this is true, but then God guided it. Okay, well, the argument doesn't apply to that because that's a category a materialist doesn't have. all right? So you got to get in the mind of what a materialist is able to do here. All I'm talking about at the moment is reason, though. We're going to talk about moral beliefs in a sec, all right? This is, I promise you, by far the hardest thing that I'll talk about, and it's a difficult thing. I want you to know about this argument because I think it's one of the most powerful arguments against materialism. And in fact, if I was in a sort of funk and felt depressed and thought, I don't know, does God exist? And maybe materialism is true. If the moment I remember this argument, I realize, well, whatever's true, this can't be true because this doesn't make any sense at all. Because I'm using my reason for my skepticism, all right? Some of you have just painful, I feel like, you know, what have I done here? Yeah. Which one? Just that second? Or on this picture? What I was saying is that beliefs, whatever they are, happen very late in the process, right? And so what they're going to be is just something that spins off. They're going to be just like if you eat the wrong thing, you have a reaction, you know, your stomach hurts. Beliefs are just a reaction, sort of a thing that happens as they're a spin-off from an electrochemical structure in your brain. But they don't cause things to happen. See, what we imagine commonsensically is that we can have beliefs. Now, it might be that we have a tummy ache, and that we know that can kind of shape our attitude too, right? It's like suddenly I had my daughter, and she hadn't had any sleep for several days, and she was very grumpy. And I said, honey, you're acting like, you know, people are doing things to you, but could it be that you just haven't had any sleep? He said, no, I'm fine. It's just that everybody is so annoying, right? It's miraculously, everybody became annoying at the same time. I'm fine, right? So we know that our beliefs sometimes can be shaped by that, but we also think that we are able to have beliefs, right? Think about them, and that they can actually cause things to happen. We can choose, and then that choice can cause something, right? But if you're a materialist, this picture makes no sense. You can't have these belief things floating around that cause things to happen in the physical world. You might as well invoke God at that point, right? It doesn't make any sense. And you can see why that is. You can see that this process, if you reflect on it, could perhaps produce survival-enhancing behavior, but beliefs, true beliefs that guide actions, just don't make any sense in this story at all. Besides which, they only appear at the very end. So they're trivial. Yeah? Oh, well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so nobody's consistent with this. Obviously, if you're a materialist and a Darwinist arguing for the truth of your belief, you're not being fully consistent with what you claim to believe. And that's how it is. I mean, it's like moral relativists, right? You have a philosophy professor, some of you guys will have this after you leave here, that will try to persuade you that moral truths are just relevant to a context and aren't sort of true out there. And so if one of you takes him to heart and slashes his tires in his car, when he comes out, he will be morally indignant, and he will think it's objectively wrong that people did this to him, right? And so you don't really have the right to live in another universe. You're going to live in the universe that exists. And so if moral truths are truths, you're not going to be able to get out of that. And so you're not going to be able to get out of using reason. So the only question is whether, if reason is sometimes reliable, what else would need to be true about reality in order for those things to exist? That's the sort of question. So what you do is, well, if this is reliable, the thing that I hold most certainly, right, could be reliable, what else would need to be true? And you work your way back that way. I mean, what about thinking itself? As you've seen, I said beliefs on that account at most would be either identical with structures in your brain, or they would just be caused, just to kind of spit off as these structures in your brain. So a book a few years ago by an atheist named Alex Rosenberg called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And here's what he says about beliefs. See, we have the idea that beliefs and our thoughts are about things, right? I'm thinking about the fact that I'm talking to you guys here in Bloomington, Minnesota. So beliefs are about things in the way that other things aren't about things. But he says that's actually an illusion. The notion that thoughts are about stuff is illusory. Think of each input-output neural circuit as a single still photo. It just happens sort of automatically for chemical reasons. Now put together a huge number of input-output circuits in the right way. None of them is about anything. Each is just an input-output circuit, firing or not. Okay, now think about this for a minute. Alex Rosenberg wrote a book presumably about things. He had thoughts, he put on pages. He wanted you to think about the things in his book. And one of the things in his book is that thoughts are not about anything, all right? This is how insane it gets. This isn't, the reason I'm showing you this is because you'd think, oh, this has to be a caricature or a straw man. But it's not. This is the actual clear implication of the idea. And it would be the implication of the idea even if no materialist said it. But they do say it. The smartest and most thoughtful ones explicitly say this. Right now, you might think this is the definition of madness. But the reality is they're using their reason here. And they're using their reason from premises that are inconsistent with the existence of reason. And so you end up in these weird knots. Right? That is an implication. And so the way I would put it is thoughts in a materialist framework are illusory and they're not actually about anything. But of course, that's an argument that presupposes that thoughts are about something, right? So since thoughts obviously are about something, there must be something wrong with this argument. That's the way I would reason. But that's because I don't hold the materialist premise so strongly that I'm not willing to consider it as false. All right, so we've got thoughts. Nope, don't get to have those. True beliefs, don't get to have those. Reason, don't get to have those. Individuals, nope. Individual rights and responsibility, nope. Don't get to have any of those things. How about moral realism? Now we reach this point because what we discover is that societies and communities and individuals, we have moral beliefs that we think are true. And in fact, whether animals have beliefs or not, there are lots of good examples of animals acting in ways that are called altruistic. That is, that act on the benefit of another, and that seem counterintuitive in Darwinian terms. Now, there's kind of ways of trying to account for that. But what I want you to see is that everyone recognizes that societies have beliefs about moral questions that we take to be true. Well, E.O. Wilson and Michael Ruse were sort of leading thinkers, and Michael Ruse is a prominent philosopher of biology and a prominent sort of Darwinian apologist. This is what they say about that. If the Darwinian account is true, it's not that people don't have moral ideas. It's just that they have a certain status. And here's what they say. Morality, or more strictly, our belief in morality, our belief in moral truth, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It is without external grounding. Ethics is illusory inasmuch as it persuades us that it has an objective reference. Now, what does that mean? What are they saying? This is what they're saying. We, at least Americans, I know you're not all Americans, but this is probably wherever you're from, your society holds a particular belief, that it's generally wrong for us to eat our children, all right? Most people, when they think about that, you probably haven't even thought about this before, but the second you heard it, you say, yep, that's wrong, absolutely, that's not a good thing to do. Well, now what are Ruse and Wilson saying? They're not saying you don't have that belief. They're not saying that it's sort of crazy to have that belief. What they're saying is that the reason you have that belief is that your society has ancestors. And at some point in the distant past, there were various human communities that had all sorts of different beliefs. And there were some societies and villages and people groups that had the idea that, well, no, we should actually eat our children quickly, right? And they had recipes for doing that and all sorts of crazy things, right? But what happened to those societies? They're like the Shakers, right? The Shakers were all celibate, so good time for a generation, and then it's all over. Right? That's what happened to those societies. That is a very selectively disadvantageous belief. Right? Societies that think it's good to eat their children don't reproduce very well. Right? They die out. But there are other societies that say, no, well, when we have children, we should nurture them, and people should look after them, and we should nurse them, and we should feed them, and we should raise them and teach them how to survive in the world. And those societies have this belief, right, that it's wrong to do that. And that belief had selective advantage, right? And so there's a reason we have these beliefs. But the reason we have these beliefs is not that this belief, it's not that it's true. It's not that it has an objective grounding. It's that it conferred on our ancestors a survival advantage to believe it. In the same way, it confers on us a survival advantage to believe that there's a God who will punish us in the afterlife if we do bad things. Right? So that kind of keeps us from doing bad things. That's the idea. Right? So yeah, we have these beliefs. And in fact, these religious beliefs, these moral beliefs, very often confer a survival advantage on us as they did on our ancestors, but they're not true. All right? That's an implication of this idea. Now, this is one of these things that materialists don't like to admit. They really don't like it. And the reason is because they know perfectly well that, people get off quickly. They get off the ride if you tell them this kind of thing directly. But so you got to turn to philosophers who are willing to sort of explain this all the way out to the bitter end. So you don't get moral realism either. So it's not objectively true that it's wrong to force people to be baptized and to say they're Christians. That's not objectively true, right? If they're right. It is objectively true, but it's not if they're right. All right? Now what happens? Well, how do we defend limited government? Remember, the very idea of limited government for the libertarian is, well, human beings have certain freedoms and responsibilities and dignity that ought to be respected. It's morally wrong for a government to use its coercive power except in very limited circumstances, like to prevent a murderer from killing somebody else. We have reason, and we can sort of argue based on our knowledge of economics in various societies that these kinds of societies are much better. We have responsibilities. We ought to be, for our actions. All those things have been completely undercut. And so the argument for limited government the libertarian might want to mount, if he or she is an atheist, he's just completely undercut the thing. So he actually doesn't have any resources left to make the argument. So what this is essentially it's what you could call suicidal reasoning, right? It's like the guy sitting on a branch high in a tree who's sawing off the branch between him and the trunk of the tree, right? It's okay if you're doing it out here. He's sawing off the trunk, the stump that he's sitting on, right? That's what suicidal reasoning is. It's undercutting the thing that you're presupposing, all right? Yeah, so this is a serious problem. Like I said, it's the worst problem you can have philosophically. And so this is why I think materialism is in many ways the least rational idea you can have, ultimately. And I'm surprised it has held on so long. Well, how do you avoid suicidal reasoning? Well, one way is you can think, I won't develop the argument for you because you guys are doing this in this program. But the Judeo-Christian idea, or the theistic idea that human beings, that ultimate reality is not blind matter in motion following blind forces, but is a transcendent and personal God who has specific intentions. And everything else flows from that. And so the created order, yes, it has sort of physical laws and there are natural processes and things that we can learn to understand, but they're not ultimate. And he creates beings who are both physical beings but also spiritual beings that have, in a limited capacity, the same sort of powers. We have the capacity for intention and for purpose. God acts with supreme and absolute sovereign freedom and creativity, and we have that in a limited sense. And because of that, you can see how a theistic framework actually is a much, much better home for the ideas of freedom and responsibility and individual rights and dignity, reason, moral truth, and the moral case for a limited government. Thank you, and let's take some questions. Thanks.
All right, are there any questions? So I have a kind of a vague memory of this, but it seems to me I came across something in Nietzsche where he basically says, we have to sort of ignore the unfortunate reality of evolution. Mm-hmm. So that basically, and then he goes on, so that we can, purposefully create, this glorious society. I mean, that seems like he should be understanding the absurdity of that, right?
Yeah, I don't know the passage. I mean, Nietzsche was very good at sort of seeing the implications of the death of God. I think of one thing he said, that we haven't fully understood the implications of the death of God until we have abolished grammar. Because itself kind of suggests an orderliness, and so he sort of saw that. But I'm not familiar with that particular passage.
But I mean, in order to actually be purposeful about creating something with intention, it's very difficult to do that in light of what you're saying.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense. Yeah.
So the implications for politics, for example, or government are what?
Well, it would be, I mean, whatever they do is going to probably be inconsistent, except that they say, well, I'm determined to do what I do, and so I want to have absolute control over my fellow human beings and torture them. I read a book, it was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm going to forget the book, but it was a story about a guy that was an East German that spent several years in an East German prison and was in the prison when the Eastern Bloc collapsed. And the guard that was in charge of questioning and interrogating him and several others said, I am so thankful to live to an age in which there is no God, so that I can express all the evil that is in my heart. So he was thankful for it. And the problem is that we still are creatures made in the image of God with faculties of reason. And so you're going to use them. And the materialist is going to use them, whether he accepts it or not, or accepts the sort of foundation for it. And so the goal here in this argument is just to say, look, you've undercut the very thing that you're invoking. So at the very least, there's no reason why we should take you, atheists, seriously. Because at least I hold a view in which I think reason can actually do things. And I hold a view in which persons actually exist and actually do have value. And so notice this is not ultimately a proof of theism so much as it is, if we hold these things to be true, theism makes a heck of a lot more sense than the other. We would expect these things to be true if theism were true. There was some question down here somewhere.
I was thinking of, we read Nancy Murphy here. I don't know if you're familiar
Nancy
with
Murphy
her.
from
Yeah.
Fuller?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So you don't mean Nancy Pearcey, you mean Nancy Murphy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
I know both of them.
okay,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
but she talked about physicalism. And
Right.
she's
Non-reductive physicalism.
Kind of says she's a Christian.
No, it's incoherent. Yeah,